Joining me on the platform is Nina Burrowes, who actually has spent her life looking at issues to do with how we operate as sexual human beings, and has recently created the Consent Collective, which we're going to talk about, and then the leader of the Women's Equality Party, Mandu Reid. Okay, I'm immediately offended. I didn't get a cheer, and Nina didn't get a cheer. And you know how easy it is to take offence these days. Okay, so we were discussing before that there are so many elements to this word consent, and I'm just looking at the range of ages in the room. I'm 67, and I think I can spot somebody who's around about 15, 14, 13, yeah. So if you think about the history of sexual consent, sexual appropriateness, religion, morals, society's norms, different cultures that we come from, different attitudes, the things that have changed between somebody who's sitting here who's 13 and somebody my age or older are enormous. There are enormous amount of changes have taken place. You know, I can remember rolling around the floor while my mother tried to grab the contraceptive pill out of my bag at 15. That was such a shock to my mum and dad that, you know, that their daughters could have sex. And at the same time, I can also remember directing plays where the idea of an intimacy director was just completely unheard of. And even as a woman director, I was, you know, directing revenge tragedies that are extremely misogynist and very violent, sort of expecting that the female actresses and the male actors would just sort of solve the issue of the sexual dynamic through good verbal direction. And now we're in a situation, and thank goodness we are, where there are whole ranges of conversations and vocabulary that have come towards us recently, or we have forged them, to make it clear that when we're talking about sex, we have to talk about the intersections of power, that there isn't one kind of sex, there is not, you know, one kind of normal sex. There's sex and how it relates to different kinds of power structures in society, and the impact that has on different bodies. We're talking about how far the law lags behind the experiences. We're talking about how older people, and I include older women, suppress the conversation that younger people need, and discount and minimize and therefore marginalize sexual experiences. I'm talking about how we have not necessarily owned our own versions of what we might call bad sex, but you could call sexual harassment or harm, and how we've had to completely recalibrate all the time something we were told was just like how it was, and start thinking that should never have been how it should be. So I'm just going to name some of the things that we can talk about if you feel like it. Stealthing, where somebody deliberately takes off their condom without you knowing and intends to do so. Cyber flashing, where you send dick pics and there's no law to stop that happening. The whole idea that trans and bisexual people will have a great deal more sexual violence put upon them, and that somehow their bodies are of less value. The whole ability of disabled people to call out their need for sex, their right for sex, and the way they wish sex to operate. The whole idea of where race intersects. Spitting, choking, the legitimization of pornographic imagery, revenge porn. How do you prevent us moving towards the idea that we want everybody just like put in prison, when at the same time we're fighting against the penal system's lack of redemptive properties? Hate wank, new phrase to me, but I've got it now. The whole idea of the porn hub and their right to keep hold of images of other people's violations and not do anything about them. The issue of rough sex defense, i.e. she wanted it to be that violent, and so that's what she got as a reason to stop people being given murder trials. So all of those things, I would say, are reasonably new phrases in a conversation, and we've got to get used to them, we've got to feel familiar with them, and we've got to discuss them. Because about 10 years ago, I suppose, we were discussing pornography as an overarching concept, harm or not. That was the sort of the basis of where we're at. Whereas there's so many more things that we need to understand. And bearing in mind that spousal rape was only taken out of the right of a partner in 1992, if you think about that, 1992 was the first time you were not any longer allowed to rape your wife or husband. And bearing in mind that Gina Miller finally got upskirting into the law in 2019, I think these are all examples of the fact that we are taking a long time to discuss sex properly. So we are going to discuss it tonight, and you must feel free to raise questions and to say things which you don't even know necessarily what they mean. I'm not saying this is a workshop on sex, I'm not qualified, but I think that I can say I was never taught what pleasure was, and therefore I was never taught what harm might look like, other than the most basic, brutal idea of if somebody jumps out in a hedge and they've got a knife, be frightened. Don't go under underpasses and don't wear short skirts. You know, that sort of harm. I was never taught what pleasure was. And I don't ever want to hear any woman, including myself, say things I have said in the past like, at least he didn't rape me. I want to hear all people, and of course this is not just about, as a cisgendered woman, this is not just about people like me. I want us to reach a place where we feel that we were safe and respected at all times, in whatever context we wanted sex to play out for us. So it's perfectly legitimate to have any version of sex, and this isn't a moral debate, but you have to feel safe and respected. So that is the sort of territory. What does ethical sex look like? And how do we have the conversations with ourselves where we demand that we rethink perhaps what we've been taught, raise our own standards for ourselves, change the standards we expect of our young people, and give them an opportunity to discuss both pleasure and harm in an intelligent way. So earlier in the green room, Mandu and Nina and I were talking about two different things, really. One is where the law stands in relationship to this idea of respect for all of us, a humane respect, and also what do we as people who understand life do in our activist capacity to help deal with sexual harm and trauma, and how do those two things work in parallel, and indeed do they? But before we get to that, I just want to ask, first of all, Mandu, whether you think personally your understanding of good sex, bad sex, consent has changed for you since you were a young person to now.
Yeah, I'm 40 years old, and it absolutely has changed dramatically. And I think that's partly inevitable, the passage of time, but I think it's also some of the things you alluded to, Jude, around how we now have dialogues and conversations in much more open ways. And there is, content out there that creates the possibility for you to reimagine in a way and perhaps reinvent your own norms around sex. I May Destroy You, a massive popular show last year, written, directed, and starred in by Michaela Coel. I mean, I was only 39 when I watched that, but that shifted things for me. And it's really, really important, I think, to have not only the vocabulary and the opportunities to discuss and explore these things and reflect on your own experiences, but actually for that to be normalized. And for me, I would say my evolution in this regard has been most rapid only in the last 5 years. I've been more honest with myself, I've been more honest with sexual partners, and it isn't just because I'm getting older. It is literally because the dynamics in the environment around me, in the circles I operate have changed. And so as a starting point, I think we can enter this conversation with a sense of optimism that there are new possibilities for all of us, for women to kind of like reclaim their own bodily autonomy, for men to be more responsive. I think we're in a position now where, and this wasn't the case when I was, say, 15, where when I was 15, I think what I was taught, similar to you, Jude, was what was put on a pedestal for me was, you know, my purity and my pliability. But actually, we should be moving towards a world where what's put on a pedestal for women and men, but women and girls in particular, is our permission and our pleasure. And I think that that is possible, and we are moving gently in the right direction. But there's a hell of a long way to go, and it's a steeplechase. Lots of leaps and jumps we have to make to get to where we need to be on that.
But I think that the point that the three of us want to make tonight, and indeed there's 5 of us here, so I'm just going to take this point to introduce Vicky and Grace for signing. Thank you very much for this. I don't know what the sign was for hate wank, but thank you for whatever it was. But the thing is that we want this to be a hopeful conversation, because for God's sake, you know, we wouldn't have been sitting here 5 years ago talking like this, would we? We just wouldn't have. Some people might have been in a small group, but this is liberation. This is what liberation looks like, that we're allowed to talk and be puzzled and wonder and change our minds, and that we're not in a place of shame about something which is so primal, but it has so many complications because of power. Nina, what about you? How's it changed for you, the landscape, personally?
I'm going to speak to activism in this space, and I'm delighted to say that my job has changed. Lots of people will point to like Me Too to explain that, but if you're like me and you've been doing in this terrain for a long time, you know that Me Too wasn't the first Me Too, and that this is actually a very nuanced, constantly changing movement. But I was in a space where my job was the same as everybody else's job in the space. We had one message. This is important, we need to start talking about it. This is important, we need to start talking about it. And it didn't matter if you were the women's officer at university, me, it didn't matter. We had one message. Now that has changed completely. If you're a women's officer at university campus, you would most likely be brought into a meeting where the university is saying to you, what should we do about this? Have you got any ideas? And I feel like, you know, certainly me and my work in this space has massively changed, because people now want to know, what is it that we should be doing about this? And then they enter into this murky terrain that I choose to locate myself in, because we should be hopeful, because things are changing and things are progressing, and that is true. But the fundamental truth hasn't changed, in that we live in a very non-consensual society. It's not a surprise that we are confused about consent. You know, when you update your software and you have to not read paragraphs and paragraphs and you tick, that's our idea of consent. Consent in this world is, do not sue me, give me permission to do something, but that's not real consent. Consent is a skill. It's an interpersonal skill. It's complex. You need to know what you want in the first place, which is, you know, maybe easy if you're choosing your breakfast, but it can be complicated if we're talking about your sex life. So we shouldn't be surprised that we trip over this issue. We should get curious about how we're framing the conversations, and if we're not creating a space where people can get better at a skill, then we're going to keep having the same conversation for a very long time. So I'm excited because the conversations I'm having are different, and the doors that are opening are different. And at the Consent Collective, we have this big conversation about consensual marketing. And so we decided that most marketing is manipulation and persuading people. And so our approach is to not market at all. People have to come to us and knock on the door. We're like vampires, you have to invite us in. But, you know, it's changing. More and more people are inviting us in. And, you know, if we want to spread a message of hope, definitely more people want to have this conversation. And what I see university campuses is that complexity is finally arriving. Like, we've figured that consent isn't actually as simple as a cup of tea when you think about it. So, like, let's have the next conversation, because we need to have it, and, you know, our kids need us to have it now.
Just to ask a question which I think the audience might want to know, exactly what does the Consent Collective do when we knock on your door and say, please enter?
We invite you in warmly, and Cynthia will make you a cup of tea. So we basically follow this topic wherever it takes us. So we work a lot with the criminal justice system. So I have the great pleasure of training every single judge in the country who hears serious sexual offence cases. Used to work with the Crown Prosecution Service when they were more interested in prosecuting rape cases. We work with the police, barristers, but we work a lot at universities because they are a particular space in our society that have been under pressure to do something about this and increasingly actually want to do something about it. So employers, regulators, university campuses, and I think the interesting thing for us is we're always having the same conversation but in a completely different way. So if you're a group of judges, you probably want me to stand and sound quite scientific, but I'm talking about consent. But if I'm at your university campus, we've got a game show called How to Be Good in Bed, and we take that round and made it a podcast. So we're an organisation that is always talking about sex, gender, sexual harassment, but we just take it everywhere we can, or everywhere we're invited to.
Okay. There's usually two people involved. There can be more, or you can be doing it by yourself. But let's just supposing there are two people involved in a sexual act. What we do know is that we play out power games, and some of that can be really exciting. But the issue of actual power in society has dominated the way that girls, women, trans and non-binary people have had to present, have what has been expected of them, the language of accommodation, the language of appeasement, the language of availability, the language that says, I don't want to upset you, what do you need, how can I renegotiate so that you'll not be cross? All of this, I need to give sexual favors in order to avoid further aggression. There's masses of ways that girls and women in particular have been groomed to the point when it is almost second nature to look available, even if they don't want to be, in order to, not be punished in some way. And yet at the same time to not look very available because they'll also be punished. And in order for us to get to a stage where we can intelligently discuss our consent and what we want, as you said, it's not easy to know what you want. You might have been told what you ought to want, and you might have felt that maybe I did want that once. But one element of all of this conversation is, how do we get to determine a boundary? What does that look like to take ourselves on a journey towards our own sexual needs, which might frighten us. It might go much more extreme, might be much wilder than we thought we would want. There's appetite that we might have suppressed, as well as things that we feel we always gave into but we didn't want. So that conversation about boundary is something that, again, who teaches that? And then who teaches somebody who's been told that they ought to have more power in the relationship because of the idea of power, because they're white, because they're non-disabled, because they are a man, all of the things that you could say denote power. Who teaches them that that doesn't equal the right to greater entitlement in a sexual context? Since sex is a place to play out power, where does that happen? So, Mandu, before we come to sort of how the law engages with all of that, perhaps could you just talk a little bit about, where you think education, both formal and informal, could engage with that idea of us knowing what boundaries look like, including our pleasure, our demand for pleasure, and people who feel that sex is power, where does that change? How do we change that?
I mean, I think it almost goes without saying, but I think it does need to be said because it's not happening. That our classrooms, our schools, as well as our sort of family and home environments, are places where these discussions about the distribution of power, the abuse of power, how that relates to sexual dynamics should be happening. Now, not everybody, the problem we have is like not everybody is equipped to lead a conversation like that, you know? And so I think it's, in a way, unfair to say, right, this is something you should be doing, educators, here's a curriculum, get on with it. There's work that needs to be done, I think, at all levels of society to give people the vocabulary. And vocabulary is super important, actually. And that's not because I'm a pedant that I'm saying that. I think vocabulary is really important because attitudes are anchored in language. For example, it drives me mad every time I see written down anywhere these two words together, child prostitute. No. For me, that concept doesn't and shouldn't exist. You're talking about a child that's being raped. And we need to be we need to be a little bit more confident, I think, about insisting on language that helps us understand each other better and helps us understand the problems we kind of need to work through together. But you can't expect people who have been socialized in a culture, in a society, in a system to overnight develop, as you say, the skills needed to take people on that journey. So it is a really big responsibility, but we all have a role to play. It's in the home. It's not always going to happen as it should in the home. It's in classrooms, and it's in organic kind of community settings as well that I know is something you've been exploring, Nina.
Yeah, there's so much paradox in this space. I think when we understand that consent is a skill, we have to understand that we're quite starved of good role models at this thing. So, you know, like a knee-jerk reaction to sexual harassment on campus is a mandatory consent workshop for everybody. A mandatory consent workshop is an oxymoron. That is non-consensual. It treats everybody the same as if we all need the same information, which we don't. This is a nuanced skill, and our society is not very good at role modeling this skill. So we need to, you know, create spaces where we can be vulnerable, learning this new skill. We need to practice it in our interpersonal relationships, whether they're professional or personal. This is the path we need to walk down. Unfortunately, too many of our conversations in this space, they become moralistic, which I think is unhelpful. I don't think this is about being a good person. I think it's about having a skill that helps you navigate difference. And power is just one of those dimensions in which we're different. And that skill is going to help you in every friendship and relationship and every job you ever have in life. But we live in this world where we're sold constantly, we're told what to do. I mean, it's school, like, who wants to go to school? Like, probably some people, maybe after lockdown, a lot more people, but, like, we're not given the opportunity to genuinely exercise our own consent and develop that skill with each other. And until we build those spaces, we're likely to have these, slightly, very divisive, moralistic, or quick fix solutions. I see lots of people reacting to this issue, and for me, when we react to stuff, that's a trauma-based response. We're quite a traumatized society, and this is a very frightening thing to talk about. So, unfortunately, when we try to create change, those changes can become from a place of pain, of fear, of trauma, and then we get these reactionary things. We need to respond to this. We need grounded, safe spaces where we can be vulnerable, where we can learn this skill, where we can role model it. We can do this, but we need to find the right space, I feel, is the solution, rather than anything that feels like we could just tweak something and it'd be okay.
And I think this issue of morals is incredibly important because, again, generationally, but it goes very deep, there's an attitude that there's sort of ordinary sex, and then there's other stuff, and, I don't do that other stuff, and that other stuff sounds frightening and a bit inappropriate, and it spreads out from there, this idea that, somebody's decided what it ought to look like, and everybody else isn't doing it quite the same way. And so I think that we know that a lot of the judgment systems that are formal come with all of those ideas of what was appropriate and what was not appropriate. And until we get rid of the morality and start talking about the human right to pleasure that sex gives, and the human right to choose the way that you wish that pleasure to happen to you, which is your right, devoid of morals, then I think it's very confusing, because we end up making judgments based on attitude. Incidentally, talking about words which Mandu was referring to, it would be unlikely if I, for one, didn't say something which wasn't quite as appropriate as you would have liked. And you're very welcome to raise it with me. Because, you know, again, like, how do we find a comfortable way of having language where we think, oh yes, we're learning from each other. This is something that would look a bit different if I had a different life experience. And so anybody who's got different life experience who wants to add into this when we get to the question time, please feel free to include this idea that we widen our lexicon in the most appropriate way possible. So we will come to questions shortly, but I'd like to now go to the idea of the law. Because Nina has said, and I think this is incredibly important that we reflect on this, the law can't solve some of the ideas around love, tenderness, healing, you know, sharing our sexual trauma and acknowledging it between us. That's not something the law does. And we also know that, you know, the most liberal parts of ourselves are very shocked by the fact that, you know, we have the highest prison population in Europe. 97% of those prisoners are men. Many of those prisoners have educational disadvantages, their own family traumas, dysfunctional experiences in their lives, violence, etc., etc. So the idea that, you know, the result of sexual harm should equal lots more people, mainly men, get shut up, doesn't sound like a solution to me. But at the same time, we do need the law to say these are the legal boundaries, and at the moment we haven't got them in the right places. So I know that you've been thinking all about this, Mandu, and also fighting for them. Where do you think we're up to in terms of the law's understanding and what we need to do as activists in that direction?
Yeah, there's a few things to say on this. What I want to start by saying is I want to be in a situation where we can just overhaul dysfunctional systems and build them from scratch again, so that we use what we've learned about what was wrong with them and create something that serves all of us so much better. I would love to be in a position to do that tomorrow. We're not in a position to do that tomorrow. And so I think it's really, really important we look at our institutions, whether they're the education system, whether they are different aspects of the criminal justice system, and we do what we can to make sure they are at least helping rather than hindering us from having the kind of justice and pathways towards healing and ways for dealing and responding to trauma. You gave an example, Jude, earlier of how it was only in 1992 that marital rape became illegal, right? That's really important. It's not because I don't think those legal changes matter because I want to chuck a load more people in jail. And if we're looking at rape in this country, in England and Wales last year, 52,000 rapes were reported, only 850 of those were charged. You ended up with a conviction rate of something like 1.6%. That sounds pretty disastrous. That sounds like a complete fail. But then imagine if those 52,000 were all convicted, where are we going to put them? And where does that leave society? But I do think that the law can send signals, really important signals that anchor us, like with marital rape. And so that's why the Women's Equality Party is campaigning for a change in the law so that we have an affirmative consent law. Consent is part and parcel of how decisions are made in rape cases. You have to prove that the woman didn't, if we're talking about a man raping a woman, that the woman didn't consent. What I'm saying is, and this law exists in other countries, that actually we should change the line of inquiry from, not from did she say no, but to did she say yes? And that would change the conversation not only in courtrooms, but also in classrooms. It would create a situation where, as I alluded to earlier, permission is really important, which would go some way towards addressing the power imbalance and those dysfunctional power dynamics that are at the heart of why sexual violence, harassment, all those things are so prevalent. So I'm not saying the law is a solution. I'm not saying you change the law and then you solve sexual violence. I'm saying you change the law so that it sets a better signal for society and a basis from which we can actually have healthier interplay between individuals. I could say a lot more on this, but it's, oh, thank you. But I want to leave it there so there's space for more exploration.
So, Nina, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, when I hear phrases like affirmative consent, it actually just makes me really feel very sad. It's like the phrase unconditional love. Love is unconditional, otherwise it's just approval. Consent should be consent. We should understand that it doesn't need this, neon light yes to be consent. So I think I'm not disagreeing with pointing the picture. It just makes me feel sad that we have to kind of double down on what consent means when, where the law stands at the moment. It's not reasonable to assume someone was consenting if they're passed out. And yet we still have cases going to court and not winning with that. I think when it comes to the law and our systems, and I'm speaking as someone who's had an unusually up-close and personal relationship with that space for a long time, and for a big while thought that it was worth my energy as an activist to try to work with those systems to improve them. I still work with them, but as an activist, the question I'm asking now, and with Cynthia, we're actually traveling around the UK asking this question, which is, how do people heal from injustice? Because unfortunately, the story for people in our country who have this experience is a story of injustice for 99.9% of them. And I want to know what they're doing with that. I want to know how they're healing from that. I want to know how they are with their families. I want to know how they are with their health and at work, and how are they healing from the injustice that they are likely to have experienced. And that doesn't mean that their perpetrator didn't go to prison at some point. You can still feel really a lot of injustice with that. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I'm really interested. Actually, I'm interested in you. I'm interested in us. What can we do about this? Because I'm not totally invested in the idea that government is able to actually change this a lot, let alone wants to and will and all of the rest of it. I've given that one a shot.
Well, we know from domestic violence that legally there's pretty much an array of legal opportunities to make sure that something isn't allowed, but it hasn't actually changed the culture of entitlement to violence. And that is something, therefore, it has to be a two-journeyed attitude, I think, in society. And I just wanted to say, yes, of course.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of bounce off that, I think the sort of top-down approach, of course, is problematic. But if you look at how violence against women, whether it's sexual violence or any other form of violence, is a cause and consequence of women's inequality, you can put measures in place that maybe have nothing to do with sex. They might be to do with free universal childcare, some things that actually close the gap between men and women and create different conditions that actually start to address the power differential that creates the space for the abuse of power, which is at the heart of so much of this stuff and the cause of so much trauma that flows from it. And so I think, there is a role for governments who have power over our lives and the type of society we evolve to be and become that may not sound obvious, but are absolutely part and parcel of the responsibility and influence they could have. And so I want to see governments using their power to make it so that these inequalities start to diminish, because I believe that would have a positive knock-on effect to help diminish the things that we're talking about that we wish weren't so.
Yeah, I think all areas of equality would change the dynamic of how power can operate, including in a sexual one. But I want to come to you now as an audience, and I did say at the beginning, perhaps we could just reflect on whether we think we have ever removed justice from somebody else by our attitude to their experience, or even removed justice from ourselves. I can remember saying things like, well, yes, I did sleep with him because it was sort of easier than doing what would have happened if I hadn't. And, I never in my mind adjusted that into a kind of consenting to be raped. I think that there's lots of avenues many of us have gone down to renegotiate our own experiences so that they were not either shameful or troubling, even though they might come back to haunt. And then if you do that to yourself, you tend to do it to other people as well. And we know from the Me Too movement how many women said things like, well, it was all fine in my day. I didn't mind somebody putting their hand on my knee. I didn't mind somebody, grabbing my tits. I didn't mind somebody wolf whistling. And so you almost like, you belittle somebody else's sense of harassment and trauma. There was a census done recently where they asked 11,000 women whether they'd ever been sexually harassed, and 61% said yes. Then they went back and said, how many of you have been groped or inappropriately touched? And they said 91%. So that gap demonstrates that somebody's version of sexual harassment is somebody else's version of, well, just something that happens to you. So, I do think the reason why this is hopeful is because you're all sitting here at 7:45 at night, getting chilly, thinking, okay, where are we up to with consent? What does that look like now in our language and our attitudes to each other and our next generations? Consequences of actions. Nina?
I'm more of a carrot person than a stick person. It comes with a consent label. So I'm much more inclined. I think everybody is interested in consent. I think we're all obviously massively invested in our own consent. I think we've all had experiences where that hasn't been listened to. And I'm not talking about sex, I mean just everything, So I would much rather than here's the threat conversation, I think it's actually, if you take the time to listen and you frame it in much more, this is how you can be the person you want to be. This is how you can develop those friendship relationships. So like when we go, so I'm working with a much older age group than you, but a university campus, consent is how you get to be really good at having sex, and you get to have good sex too. And if you're not good at it, you won't have good sex. That's a better incentive than, don't be a rapist. It's also, an essential life skill, this consent thing. And you can feel it, when you have an argument with your friends and it feels like your whole world is falling apart. I bet consent is at the heart of that argument. And so it's about helping people understand. We talk about sex because when you get consent wrong in sex, you can cause immense pain to someone else. But we're getting consent wrong and right in every area of our life. It's just here you cause a lot of damage. So that's why we're talking about sex. But consent is this broad skill. So I would very much go carrot. And I also, with the schools, I'm glad you should be doing what you're doing. I think it's awesome. We should absolutely be talking about this in schools. But I always notice when we put that amount of pressure on the group in our society who have the least power, children, I think we're missing the point. It's the most powerful people in our society who need to do the work. They can't put, we'll just I'll just grow old and die with kids to get it right. They can't save our planet. They're not going to fix consent. We have to do the work. So could you also invite the parents in and the teachers? And could we be doing this in old people's homes and care homes and everywhere? Because actually, we can't hand this one over to the next generation. We have to do the work ourselves because what they need is role models. And if we aren't those role models, they won't learn this skill.
But just to add to that, I think personal pleasure, but not at someone else's expense. And on the panel alongside us, she wasn't able to make it in the end, was Soma Sarah. She's the young woman who founded Everyone's Invited, where all those testimonies from schools have been shared about what girls are going through in the context of school at the hands of boys who are pursuing their pleasure, I'm sure. I don't know where they're learning it from, but it's not hard to guess. And so I do think there's the complexity rather than simplicity is really, really important here. So yep, let's all pursue pleasure and that's the optimum, but let's recognize that pursuing pleasure at someone else's expense, making somebody feel fearful or degraded or whatever it may be, if they've not asked you for those feelings, is a problematic notion. And what is it in our culture that's sending those messages? Is it pornography? Is it I don't know. I'm just saying, are there things that we need to examine and teach people to, youngsters even, to critically appraise, so that the experience in different contexts, whether it's schools, whether it's universities, whether it's workplaces, whether it's out and about in the world, is an experience that doesn't result in a big proportion of the population being, having to live under the spectre of being harassed, having to live under the spectre of sexual violence being a possibility.
I do want to say, though, that having watched porn in Japan, I was there directing, this is very, absolutely true, I was there directing a play. No, absolutely, I'm open. I was directing a play. I was in a hotel, I kid you not, every other single person in there was a Japanese monk and me. I don't know why I was in that hotel, but I was. And switching on the television, there was the most incredible pornography. And it was all bondage and the most extreme violence against women I've ever seen. And I did think that was a reflection of the anxiety of the society. So I think, your earlier point, which is that, pornography will always be there and, why shouldn't it be? But the level of violence and humiliation, degradation and specificity targeted against kind of, who you want to humiliate and how, is very specific as well to other ideas society has about itself. And, we lump pornography all into one thing as if it is one thing. But of course, there's different kinds of pornography. There's pornography made by, with and for women. There's pornography made in very specific ways. And then there is pornography intended to deeply degrade further people who already are powerless. And so some of it is extremely violent and I think we ought to know more about pornography. We ought to watch it more. I mean, we actually think we ought to understand it more. I don't know whether you agree with that.
I think it's a shame that, because pornography is largely free, and so it's competitive, so it's clickbait, so they have to make it extreme. That's the cycle they're on. It's the same as the news. They have to scare the life out of us and tell us everything is a tsunami and an epidemic these days. It's feeding into that, and so I think, if you watch porn, watch it, but pay for it maybe. I think it'd actually help if it wasn't free, because it wouldn't be doing this competitive, I'm more outrageous. And I know we've talked about the people causing harm as if this is all about their power and their pleasure, but having worked with these individuals, it's massively about their brokenness. This is really a story about pain being paid forward to a huge degree. The sexual dysfunction amongst rapists is massive. This is not actually a story of pleasure on their part. It is a story of trauma and brokenness. I'm not excusing their behavior, I'm just describing the reality of their psyche. If some young man in my life was accused of something, my first question would be, what's wrong with you? What's happened? That it's exposed itself in this way. So I think, when we can get more sophisticated with our conversations, when society feels it's ready to have a more sophisticated and nuanced idea of the people who are causing harm, then I think we can start the work of really supporting people who actually don't necessarily want to harm others or don't realise they are. And I promise you, most of those stories are going to be stories of brokenness being paid forward, pain paid onto someone else, which is why this work can be so sad, but it's also why it can be so hopeful, because most people want to be helped with their pain, in my experience. I think, for me, this is a good example of power. So for me, that has to be led by people with disabilities themselves. There's an awesome organisation called Disabled Survivors Unite. I love them because they're representing their own voice, and I think that's what we need. I think too much in the past, other people have decided what disabled people want, are allowed to want, can do, and we need to listen. That has to be the first step. We need to listen to them, and then support them in that journey, whatever that might be. But I think step one is listen, and step one is and part of that is about empowering and supporting those voices within those communities that could do that with us. So it's definitely one of those situations where you walk with someone, you don't do it to them, you don't do it for them, And that's definitely been the mistake we've made in the past.
And also, you know, there have been deeply held attitudes of kind of infantilization around the area of disability. I mean, my sister died of MS, and I was able to watch the kind of attitude to her change from, in a way, she was a young woman with a lot of personal agency, to somebody who could be talked about and over and ignored. And the idea that, you know, she could still have sex with her husband was somehow almost distasteful, you know, as if it was going to sort of, you know, A, hurt her, and B, not give him any satisfaction. I mean, I even had a conversation with somebody where they said, do you think her husband ought to go to a prostitute, was the phrase, you know, to get his satisfaction. I mean, it's nice that he's caring for her, but what about his needs? And it was all so sort of, you know, nothing about love or understanding or learning. And I just in case we think that we're like way off the starting blocks into some of these attitudes, Julian Assange, as you know, was accused of rape, and then he had the cases against him dropped. And this is in Sweden, one of the countries, I think it's number 2 or number 1 in terms of sexual equality, gender equality, I mean. And these are the things that the overriding number of people said when they discovered that, you know, this was what had happened to these 2 women, which was actually stealthing, as it turned out. They said, when people have sex, this is what happens. When people sleep with people at parties, this is what happens. Men are like this. You know, women have got to put up with it. Drunk people having sex is always like this. And I thought, my God, you know, that's Sweden. So there was a massive kind of consensus at the moment, which is that, you know, boys will be men will be boys still, and women have got to put up with it, and we can kind of condone it. And I genuinely think that we haven't come out strongly enough against that. But I think both Nina and Mandu are saying you don't come out just with one weapon saying, you know, it oughtn't to be like this. We have to look at our own history, our own education, our own language, and see if we can change the narrative for ourselves, as well as what the public debate should look like from a legal point of view. So we said we'd end with a hopeful note. I mean, I think the fact that you're here talking about it is a hopeful note. And the fact that we can see the power structures and talk about them in the way that, again, I don't think we did 10 years ago. Some did, but not many. And now we can see it. Doesn't mean we know how to solve it, but at least you know what you're looking at. And go away from this conversation, and perhaps if we can all be just a bit bolder about what we talk about and how we talk about it, and kind of rethink perhaps our own histories and say, what did we let go that we perhaps shouldn't have done, and what have we disapproved in somebody else that maybe we weren't listening to them properly. I mean, I think it is about us as well as the other people that need to be more perfect. Can I thank Vicky and Grace tremendously, and of course the technicians. Thank you so much, guys. And thank you. I think it's time, isn't it, for a dance or some alcohol or something like that. Okay, bye-bye.